Welcome back, guys. I introduced you to the management aspects of logistics systems. We talked about organizational aspects, planning aspects, and issues related to controlling. Now let's switch to a new part of this lecture. Today we start dealing with transportation issues. Some of the transportation issues may sound familiar because you already heard about them in an introductory way in the course Logistics Management. Now let's continue with this knowledge. The learning goals for today's lectures are: you should understand and be able to explain what a transport chain is. You should be able to identify transport chains. Second, you should be able to explain the advantages and disadvantages of 6 different modes of transport. These modes of transport are rail, road, sea, inland waterway transport, air transport, and transport via pipelines. Finally, you should be able to state principles of different transshipment terminals. This part of the lecture is mainly based or inspired by the textbook from Gleisner and Femerling, which is called Logistics Basics, Exercises and Case Study. You see the references in APA style here. I don't know if you have heard of APA style yet. This is a preferred way of referencing sources used at geotech, and these are the resources. As you do not have physical access to the library, I will upload a PDF version of this textbook to Moodle. You will find it on Moodle, and it is important that you have a look at this textbook because I will not go into all the details on the slides, though you will need to study some of the pages of this textbook on your own in order to get a full picture of the things we're dealing with. Let's start with transport systems. Transport systems can be designed as transport chains. So let's look at this very important element of most transport systems, transport chains. A transport chain is characterized by all the stations a good moves through, and by the connections or linkages between these stations. And a transport chain, or we analyze or look at a transport chain usually from the place of dispatch, the place of origin, or in graph terminology, the source, until the good is at the customer, the receiving point, the destination, or again in graph terminology, the sink. Many transport chains have the following structure. You will find this in many real-world transport systems. We move the goods from our source to a first transshipment point. This step is called pre-carriage. Often this movement involves only very short distances. After this first step, the main carriage continues. The main carriage is done between 2 transshipment points. Often the main carriage happens over a much longer distance. And finally, the on-carriage happens at the last step of the transport chain. From the transshipment point, we go directly to the sink or the receiving point. Let me give you one example where you might have experienced this already yourself. Many airline networks are operated on this idea. So we have smaller airports that are close to the passengers. From the smaller airports, there is a flight to the bigger airports called hub airports. So for example, if you want to travel to the United States, often there's not really a direct connection from Muscat Airport to San Francisco Airport. However, what often happens is that you start in Muscat Airport, which is close to your area of living. Then there's a smaller plane going to a big hub airport, for example Dubai. Then other passengers from other areas, for example from the Middle East, with a similar destination, also are collected in Dubai. Then in Dubai, where we aggregate the flow of passengers at the Dubai airport, we can use a bigger plane for the main carriage, and then our big plane goes to the United States, for example to the airport of New York. This would be our next transshipment point, and then from New York the on-carriage happens again in smaller planes to San Francisco. So we change the means of transport, small plane, big plane, small plane, and this is a typical transport chain following the structure. Now, why do we have the structure and what is the advantage of this structure? If you fly directly from Muscat to San Francisco with a small plane, the cost per passenger will be typically much higher than compared to a big plane. You realize economies of scale by using a bigger plane that is used to a higher that is used by many passengers. And on the other hand, there's also not such a high demand that you could have a daily trip from Muscat Airport directly to San Francisco Airport. Therefore, employing such a network makes much more sense, because there are many more people interested to going to Dubai and then continue their voyage than there are people that want to directly go to San Francisco Airport. Though you see this structure exists in everyday life, and it is usually more efficient to follow such a structure. Now, when we're talking about such a structure, there are two more terms that you should know as logistics students. First of all, combined transport, and closely related to combined transport, intermodal transport. What is combined transport? By combined transport, we characterize the movement of goods through a transport chain in one and the same loading unit. Though the important thing is, we go through a transport chain, possibly with transshipment points, etc., but our goods are always transported in the same loading unit. We do not handle the goods themselves. We don't do a repackaging while the goods are in our transport chain. This is important. No repackaging, no handling of the goods themselves. We handle always the loading unit. A typical loading unit that comes to mind today is the container. We only transport a container from the point of origin to the transshipment point, from the transshipment point to another transshipment point, and then to the destination. We do not remove the goods from the container, pack it in another container or in a different loading unit. We don't do this. We don't change the loading unit. And if this happens, we speak of combined transport. Intermodal transport now is combined transport using 2 or more modes of transport. Let me give you one example. Again, we are looking at container transport. We collect the container from an industrial company, for example, via truck. So our mode of transport is the street. Then the container is transported to a port, for example in Sohar, and the container is loaded onto a ship. So we do not change the loading unit, and because we involve ship transportation, we change the mode of transport. Our ship arrives at the destination port, and from the destination port the container is discharged, and we distribute the container, for example, again via truck or railway to our receiver. This would be an example for intermodal transport, because we use different modes of transport, at least 2 different modes of transport, and we do not change the loading unit. Though, as a small exercise, do a short internet research and read about roll-on, roll-off transport, ro-ro transport, and train ferries transport. Try to find out what this is and why the loading unit does not change in these types of transport.